we are in the middle of chapter 6 of a very, very, I don't know if the word is deep or important or fundamental, a discussion about understanding the unity of Hashem, the oneness of God. And it's a fascinating subject because we're talking about things that are out of our regular zone of understanding. If we're talking about ingredients to make a cake, talking about how to make challah, so it's what we can relate to. Okay, so you take this much flour, this much oil, this much sugar, this much this, and we're talking about ideas that to begin with are abstract. There are things that don't have a physical dimension that we can relate to. Sometimes they don't even have a spiritual dimension we can relate to. And we're trying to discuss and decide and understand how does Hashem's creation of the world work. But nevertheless, we have to do our best as a mitzvah to understand and know God. So we have to try and understand it. So we're discussing now, in the beginning of this section of Tanya, we were discussing the word Havaye. God has multiple names that we use to understand Hashem's expression. Obviously, there's one God, but different names represent how he extends or expresses himself. So the name Havaye, we said, was chesed, was transmission, was giving, was light, was energy. And the name Elokim, we started talking about, we didn't go into it in depth. We said was Tzimtzum, concealment, contraction. I gave a metaphor in the beginning of the chapters, is Kishemesh Umagen Havaye Elokim, that we said that Hashem is a metaphor to understand God is the sun. What does that mean? As we mentioned, there are two names that we're talking primarily about in Tanya. One is the name Havaye, which is how we call Yud K Vav K. Hashem's name Yud, then Hey, then Vav, then Hey. We say Havaye just for short to know how to pronounce, know what we're referring to. And the name Elokim, so Havaye represents chesed, shining. It's a force of giving, openness, of expression of God's essence. Elokim is the name of God used for concealment. We explained miracles, that which is above nature, happens from Havaye, happens from God's essence that breaks through into our world. We see above nature, above possibilities. Elokim represents the name of God. It's the name of God that represents concealment. Nature. We explained that there were three definitions of the word teva. The word Elokim has a numerical value of the word hateva, the nature. But also, we said hateva could mean nature. It could mean like a matbeya, something which is set in a certain pattern. It's coined, it's canonized in a certain way. And we said teva also means to be sunken in. Something which is sunken in, you can't see. For an example, if I put into a pool or into a bowl of something, an item, you can't see it anymore because it's hidden in this below the surface where it's hidden. God's energy is hidden within the nature, within what seems to be the process that always seems to be almost like a given. If you plant sunflower seeds, you'll get a sunflower plant. If you plant apple trees, you get an apple plant. We know what's going to happen. We know what time the sun will rise in 60 years from now. I mean, I don't know, but I could look it up online. But the scientists can figure out because they know when there'll be an eclipse. There's a system, a pattern set into nature. Above nature doesn't follow rules, doesn't follow anything. The idea of Havaye, which is the God, which is creative power, and Elokim, which is the concealment. In this chapter, we're going to give a very beautiful eye-opening. What is Shem Elokim? We're really going to help us understand Elokim, and we started doing it just before in our last class to understand Elokim. And naturally, if we just read it without getting the insights of the Alter Rebbe, Elokim seems to be a name of concealment. Is the metaphor we gave, or the pasuk we quoted was Kishemesh Umagen Havaye Elokim. Like the sun and a sheath, like the sun and a cover is God. Some people, I heard people in the show I talked to who understand a lot more about nature and science and physics than I do. Some say that the shield is the crust of the sun that hides a tremendous amount of energy. Some want to say it's the ozone layer. Some want to say it's this. Whatever the case is, Hashem built into the system something that blocks a huge amount of sun. Even though the sun is 93 million miles away, if there wasn't some sort of protective shield, the energy of the sun would literally destroy us. The only reason we could function is because Hashem blocks the sun, and what comes to us is a much smaller amount. If you multiply the distance by the concealment, the sun actually is comfortable. I just sit outside. Not today, it's raining. Even though the rain is good today, it's a sign of healing between Pesach and Shavuos. Rain is healing, and all those need healing. Hashem should give them a complete and lasting refuah. But the sun is pleasant, feels good on your skin. Why is that? Because it's so much blocked. Try and go within, a million miles to the sun without the concealment. You probably won't get that close. Probably burn your tips of your fingers because it's too intense. Same way Hashem's energy to create the world is like the sun. It is such a powerful energy that's required to create the existence. That creative power we couldn't handle. So within the creative force of Havaye, at the same exact time, Hashem had to have Elokim, which conceals it, like a set. And it's that combined effort of Havaye and Elokim that allows the power to create, and at the same time to conceal the power of creation that we can exist. Otherwise, the metaphor he gives in the beginning of Tanya, we'd be like somebody or something that's trying to be within the sun. Even the light of the sun doesn't exist within the sun. If you would travel back to within the sun, the light doesn't exist there, even though you must say it exists there because it comes from there and we feel it millions of miles away. But in the sun, it loses identity because the sun is so intense on its own. The light is not even a factor. It's not even recognized or seen. It's completely bottled, completely nullified in the presence of the sun itself. That's how we would be without Elokim. We would be so nullified before God, like the sun light within the sun. That's what we said in the chapters preceding this one. Now we're going to continue what we started off in this chapter and explaining a little more in depth the word Elokim in a beautiful way to understand. And the key, just to know in advance, the key element this chapter is going to give us, chapter 6, is that Havaye and Elokim are not two different things. It's one. See, we picture things because in our universe where we live, everything is either one or the other. You can't say that something is round and square at the same time. It's either round or it's square. To say it's both doesn't have a possibility. It can't be both. Is it round or square? And the answer, yes. Well, it can't be. In spirituality by God, who's not limited by any space, definition, interpretation, or limits, it's possible to be both at the same time, or two things not to be opposites. In our world, fire, which is Gevurah, and water, which is Chesed, are opposites. They can't coexist. It's impossible. You have a choice. Either the fire will overwhelm the water, or the water will overwhelm the fire. Hashem can make them exist. We know the famous case, the 10 plagues. One of the plagues was hail that came down as beautiful Molotov cocktails from heaven. And those who had a mixture of fire and water, they made peace. Hashem could have them make peace. And we'll see in a few minutes that when Hashem makes peace between them, it's very different than when we find ways to incorporate both Chesed and Gevurah. And we'll go through that. So we are in chapter 6, page 160. For those who are following inside, it is approximately 6 lines from the top, or 7 lines. The first word on the line is Bechina. It's like a half a word with an apostrophe. Bechina is Gevurah. We're starting from the middle of the line where it says V'hine me'eskal lazu. So we started explaining something phenomenal. And we're starting to explain, and that is as follows. The first step is, and we really started this last class, but it's important to start from here today. At first glance, Chesed seems to be kindness. Gevurah seems to be strictness. I mean, the technical, really scientific terms is attraction or rejection. Chesed really attracts. Gevurah rejects. But for our point, we're going to call it kindness and strictness. Chesed and Gevurah seem to be opposites. But the truth is, and we explained this before, Gevurah really is a form of Chesed if it's used right. How is Gevurah a form of Chesed? And the metaphor we gave in the past was, if I want to fill up, well, let's use actually a better metaphor now outside the rain. If Hashem wants to give rain, Chesed would be that Hashem opens the heavens and gives, and 1 trillion gallons of water comes down at one shot, an absolute kindness. Open up the gates, and water comes down and smothers and drowns the earth. What do you mean? Your guy wants to fill up a cup of water. I take a fire hose and I fill it up. What do you mean? You're not happy? It's the most water. No, I can't receive so much. It's not kindness. A kid wants candy and you give him 1,000 pieces of chocolate. That's not kindness. You're actually hurting the child. Gevurah, Tzimtzum, what it does is it balances it out by saying, I'm going to hold back the amount that would overwhelm you. So it's restriction, it's rejecting this expression, but really it's an act of kindness. When Hashem takes the rain, instead of giving it down to one giant blob, puts it in Gevurah and makes it into millions and millions of tiny droplets, that's the greatest kindness he can do. You ever tried watering your grass or watering a new plant? You could take the garden hose, put it on full blast, and have a great time watering your plant. Or you could put it on a mist or a soft, gentle thing and water the plant gently. You might think, 1 second, but the plant needs water. The more I give it, the better. No, it's not. The give it in the way that it can receive is better, especially when it's a younger, less strong surface that needs, or plant or tree, etc. So the first thing I want to point out is really that chesed, that's tzimtzum, gvura, the contraction, concealment, or holding back, really is a beautiful form of giving. If it's done in the right way, it's actually an act of kindness. So it's interesting. That which we called a moment ago, gvura, restriction, holding back, actually is the greatest form of giving. When I give you in a way that you can receive, instead of taking a full dump truck and dumping, 10,000 pounds of, salad on your plate, I instead give you a limited amount, just a couple pieces of lettuce and tomato. That is kindness, because I'm giving you the way you can receive it comfortably and enjoyably. Okay, so we say this coming together is called hiskalos. Hiskalos is a beautiful word that's found in Hasidus. We use it many times in many ma'amarim. It's used all over. Just to explain again, hiskalos means when you take different components that are very different from each other and they complement each other in the final product. An example would be a painting. We take all different colors, each one on their own is pure and simple, but you bring it together in a harmonious, beautiful way, and it becomes a beautiful painting. Or music. Take that all different instruments, have one conductor bring together all different types of instruments and make music. And the same thing will be in many other cases. The example I like to use a lot because it helps to see the differences is to take a watch. All different components, springs and pieces and hard and softer and round and square and all different parts. You make together a gorgeous Rolex watch, hundreds of pieces, each one's different. You might say, can't we all be the same? No, we have to be different in order to create the final product. The more different we are, the more we are our own identity, we can actually create something new. That's called a scholar. The differences is what makes us more beautiful, is because we're different. I fill in the pieces you don't have. And that's the scholars. So chesed and gvur coming together, that is one of the beautiful forms of a scholars. Famous example we'll get to soon as we move along, will be the example of a parent, disciplining a child who the parent loves. If it's not your kid, let him run in the traffic. What do I care? Let him have as much cookies as he wants. What do I care? I don't know who the kid is. Your person can be callous and cold because I don't care about the person. If it's someone I love, a child that's part of my circle who I care about, no, don't let him go in the street. Oh, why are you getting so angry? I'm not angry. This is kindness. I love him. You have to know that there's different expressions that are brought about in the right format, that all could have one end called love, compassion, concern, and sometimes it's in the form of chesed, sometimes in the form of gvura. So inside he says, from the fact that the different middos can come together, and we're explaining now an interesting idea. We're going back how it is by Hashem, how it is by God, how it is in the form of creation. From the fact that middos, chesed and gevurah, which are middos meaning characteristics, emotions in this case, the fact that middos come together in a harmonious way and work together is a sign. We see from here something amazing. The iyu v'garmiyu chad. We say every Shabbos, before Shabbos starts, the Pasach al Yo. We have a beautiful quote from the Zohar, the introduction to the Zohar, that we say every single Friday afternoon before Mincha. Beautiful piece describing all the spheres and God's relationship to the world, and we explain what they are. And he says that you are one with your middos. God, you are one with your middos. How do we know God's one with his middos? How do we know God's kindness and God's strictness and God's compassion and God's resilience and God's submission, all those things that God uses to create, and that's what we are created in his image, have the same characteristics? How do we know they're really one with God? Maybe they're not. Maybe there's like us. There's Moshe, and I have my feelings. My feelings not always me. Sometimes our feelings actually don't represent me. I'm actually acting kind when I don't really feel it. I can act angry when I don't really mean that deeply. I can get angry at someone I love, and I get all annoyed. And the truth is, it's not really me. Well, you see now, that's not me acting. I'm just the troubled mood. I'm bothered by something else. I had a long day. I didn't sleep. I have a headache. I'm jet lagged. I'm acting not like me. By God, his middos, his emotions are his essence. They're actually him. He is one with them. How do we know that? So he says like this, beautiful. He says, from the fact that Hashem's middos could merge and become one, this shows the truth that Hashem and his middos are one. Let's see how he explains that inside. Because they are one with Hashem, meaning Hashem's kindness, Hashem's chesed, Hashem's gevurah, Hashem's strictness is one with Hashem. It's not like there's Hashem and he has kindness. Hashem is his kindness. And by the way, whenever we say Hashem's names really are middos. As we said, Havaye is chesed, Elokim is gevurah. So Hashem's names, those are names that we use. Hashem's names, which represent how he's functioning right now. Is he functioning a way of kindness, functioning a way of strictness, etc.? Those are his names. His names are, that's how he's called. Sometimes we call Hashem the warrior, Kael, Gadol, V'Noida, powerful, the warrior. Sometimes we call him the protector. It depends which name we use. These names represent emotions of kindness and strictness. And we say these are Hashem's identity and his essence, not just added components that are like clothes that we have, we put on ourselves, but this is Hashem's essence. It's like this. Because they are one with Hashem. And that's why they can become one. How is it possible for two opposite middos to become one? And just to explain, we also have middos that become one. When I'm actually, as I mentioned before, when I discipline a child for running into traffic, I'm not being mean or strict. I'm actually extending love, but I'm using that form. You see, when human beings express a combination of two middos, one is the main player and one is the miniature player. One loses identity a little bit. For example, in this case, if I am acting with kindness to help the child, no, don't go here. In truth, what you really see primarily is my chesed, but it's coming out in the form of gvura. Or if I'm doing other things, if I'm being mean to somebody, if I pretend to be nice to them, yeah, it's okay. I don't mind. Certain times you can be kind, which really is not being nice to a person. Yeah, go on this train, go on that. Those behaviors, you see only the cruelty or the strictness or the lack of kindness. So whenever you have a scholars, whenever you have a combination of two middos by a human being, one is primary and one is secondary. One is a stronger middah, one's a weaker middah. That means one is compromising and bending to the other and assisting the other. By Hashem, no middah gets smaller. Each one remains 1,000% strong, and yet they can merge together. So by us, it's not a novelty that they can merge together. It makes sense. I put a little bit of sugar, a little bit of salt in. I want it to be savory, I'll put more spices, a little less sugar. I want it to be more sweet, I'll put more sugar, a tiny bit of salt, just to bring out the flavors. But by Hashem, he puts the equal amount of salt and sugar, and they each have their identity, and they don't lose it. Nevertheless, they become one. How does that make sense? It only makes sense because they're one with Hashem. Just to give a metaphor, and I'm not sure if this metaphor is right, so I'm giving a disclaimer. This is a Moshe made up metaphor. A metaphor would be that a parent can have two different siblings. One is an extremely quiet, simple, subdued, docile character, and one is an aggressive, loud, but they're two siblings. What's their bond between each other? They're nothing like each other. It's what makes them one. The fact that they came from the same mother. Their unity is that they came from the same mother. That's where they're one. You know where we're one? The same flesh and blood. Your DNA is the same because you came from the mother. What bonds them to each other is not their personality, not their character, not the level of observance, not how they express themselves. Their unity is they're both connected through the mom. We're siblings. So in a certain way, the same thing is true about Chesed and Gvur of Hashem. They're completely different. They're not even the same. So what makes them one? What's the bond between them? The unity between them is created through their Hashem. Because they're one with Hashem, therefore they can be one. Now by Hashem, we have an added component that's not found by human beings. And that is, Hashem is the possibility to be two opposites at the same time. We know the famous example given in the Kodesh HaKadoshim, the Holy of Holies, in the Beis HaMikdash, where the Holy of Holies was 10 by 20 cubits, and you had the Aron HaKodesh, which was 2.5 cubits by 1.5 cubits, and nevertheless, it didn't take up space. So if you measured exactly the Aron, it was 2.5 by 1.5. But if you measure on either side, it was 10 cubits on each side. So 1 second, which one was it? Was it there or not? In other words, the outside of the Aron, there was a full measurement of the room. It was 20 cubits wide. And at the same time, you could measure 10 cubits on each side and 2.5 in the middle. How is that possible? It's because space was not a factor by God. The round and the square was equal. Because the middos, the shame, the names of God are one with him, therefore these two could meld together perfectly. So we're saying it, and we'll say it inside now, you'll see it very nicely inside. How is it possible for Chesed and Gvura to remain their identity? One's a square, one's a circle, one's fire, one's water, one's kindness, one's restriction, and to become one and not to diminish each other. It's only because they're bound through Hashem, because they're one with Hashem, and they have that quality, that oneness with God that allows them to bond with each other. It's a super rational concept. It's not something the mind can wrap around. You can't wrap around how that makes sense. But the reality is that it does exist that way because, and only because, the emotions or the names of Hashem are one with Hashem. Let's see how Eliyahu Hanavi says it in the Zohar. So you have like this. Kemaimer Eliyahu. I'll go back one line. Because because the emotions are one with Hashem, therefore they could become one with each other and include each other in the final beautiful product. Like Eliyahu says in Pasuk Eliyahu that we said every Friday, the Antu, you are the one, the kasher lein and meyachid lein v'chulu. You are the one that bonds and combines the Middos of Hashem, ubar menech, and without you, God, lest yechuda be'ilah chulu, there couldn't be any unity. The reason why there's unity in above, why Michael and Gabriel could sit down and have lunch together, they could sit by the same table and shake hands, they could serve together, is because their bond is that we have one Father. In other words, we have one mother, we have one connection. We are not two distinct individuals for real, because both of us are part of our source, our God, our essence, and therefore we're one, and therefore we're not a conflict to each other. So in the bad metaphor that I gave before, the two siblings, they could be totally different characters. What brings them together is the same flesh and blood because they come from one place. Difference is, in the human beings, they're actually different, and they can't really combine properly. They have a bond that's one, where by God, Chesed and Gevurah can actually become one without one diminishing the other. Okay. Now, based on this, now let's go back to the famous verse that we started off the whole Shaar Hayichud Chapter. We started off this section of Tanya with a verse that says as follows: you shall know in your heart. In the beginning, we asked the question, what do you mean you have to know in your heart? Work. It sounds like take great effort to know there's no one else but God above in the heavens and down to earth below, nothing else besides him. I mean, a basic believer, if you're a believer in God, there's no one else. What do you think? There's someone else out there? So what does it mean to work and deeply? It's to recognize something different we're saying. Let's take this passage and understand it much differently. V'yadaita, you should know, Ki Hashem hu Elokim. Don't know that there's no one else. Of course, no one else. Know that Havaye and Elokim are really one. You see, if you just came through before this section of Tanya, you would say, okay, so Hashem has two powers: the power of Havaye to create, the power of Elokim to conceal, and that's two forces. He says, no, that's what you might think, and that's not the ultimate belief in God. Ultimate belief is that you know Havaye, you know Elokim. They're both one. It's not two separate things. Not that there are multiple gods, forbid the multiplicity amongst God. There's no Trinity in Judaism. There's no multiple faceted God. God is a single entity with no parts, no fragments, no division, no separations. What you see is Havaye, and what you see Elokim is absolutely one. You're only looking at it through your lenses. If you wear certain glasses, you can look at the world. Hey, everything's pink, everything's blue. Is it really blue? No. I'm looking at it with my eyes, so I see it as pink or blue. But in truth, you should know Havaye and Elokim are really one, and that's what the pasuk is telling us. The novelty of this pasuk now, to appreciate on a deeper level, is not saying there's no one else besides God. That you know from before. Hashem said, "Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I'm God. Don't have any other gods." So what's this pasuk telling us? Not that there's no other gods. No other gods we knew already. Welcome to the club. We have that pat. We have it down pat. No other gods. What we're teaching us ourselves here is to work on ourselves to know that there's no such a thing as different powers within God. You know the power of Havaye that creates. You know the power of Elokim that conceals. It's all one. I'm going to explain that right now in the next couple lines, how that makes even sense. We just spent time saying that Hashem creates with Havaye and conceals with Elokim. Now we're saying it's all one. It's all one in truth. It's from our perspective that we see differences. Rabbi Yael Khan, bless him, memory, gives a beautiful metaphor. He said the metaphor that he uses to understand this, he says, is like a teacher who wants to explain a very deep idea to his students. And the idea is very deep. So the teacher is going to use a very beautiful and complex metaphor called a mashal. And that mashal, that metaphor will make it clear to the student what he's saying. So he gives the metaphor, and the students hear the metaphor. Now, something very different happens between the teacher and the student. From the teacher, the metaphor didn't really exist. It was nothing more of a vehicle to explain a point. So he didn't see the metaphor as a metaphor. He just saw the point being expressed in that way. He saw an idea, and he's giving it over in the form of a metaphor, but really the metaphor never existed as a real story. There really was no cat and mouse or the two people spilling soup or all the other stories that we have. It was just an idea being shared, and the metaphor didn't really exist. It was just a way to present something. To the students, wow, that's an amazing metaphor. That's a brilliant idea. Let me understand it. Now, as they understand it well, they go, 1 second. Now I understand what the teacher was saying. The teacher was saying such and such, and now they understand the point he was teaching. But it was through a metaphor that existed as a brilliant idea within itself. So you have the teacher and the student, the two different realities. To the teacher, there never was a metaphor that was there. It was just a instrument that he used to teach a thought, and he used a metaphor as a delivery vehicle. To the students, first, before they had the lesson, there was the metaphor, the mashal. And when they understood, so that's how in other words, the metaphor became a tool and a vehicle, but a tool, a vehicle that was very prominent. And only through that vehicle do they understand the teaching of the teacher. And therefore, by them, there actually is a metaphor. There's a story. The famous joke about the difference between the Shlemiel, the Shlemazel, and a Nudnik. The Shlemiel spills the soup on someone else. The Shlemazel is the one that gets spilled on, and the Nudnik wants to know what type of soup was it. It's not important. It doesn't matter the soup. That's not the point. But the student can get caught up. 1 second. So what happens in the story? Because the story takes up on a life of its own. Whereas to the teacher, there was never a mashal. So to Hashem, the fact that he uses Havaye and Elokim, that's just a way to explain to us, and our minds can understand how things really develop in creation. But in truth, there's no Havaye, there's no Elokim, it's all God. These metaphors, these things are just used for us to understand the concept. It's almost, I once heard from Rabbi, I read actually, I didn't hear it from him directly, I read in his article, or in one of his books, Rabbi Steinsaltz, of blessed memory, explains that when he wants to give the introduction to the whole book, the whole Shaar Hayichud Chapter, the whole section of understanding God, so he says, imagine somebody gives you a map of a certain city that you're going to visit. And the map has a legend on the side. And it says all the roads in red are state highways. If they're in blue, they're federal highways. If you see a small little person, that means the town is less than 1,000 people. If you see a big person, it means it's over 1,000 people. And all different things. He says, do you think when you get there, there's really a red road and a blue road? Do you really think you're going to get there and see a giant man and a little man? We're just using these ways to catch your attention, to explain you. I could have used anything. I'm just using these as a way to tell you, how do you know when you're walking through and looking to the red roads all mean they're federal highways. They're blue state highways. In other words, the metaphors that we're using are only vehicles to explain us a point. It doesn't really mean that there's a separate Havaye and a separate Elokim. It's all one force of godliness, but we need to understand it, so we explain it in certain ways. Let's see this inside. So he says, and this is what it means. This is what the pasuk says. Work on yourself to know. Ki Havaye Elokim, Hashem is Elokim. Now, when we say that, we have a question in a minute, which I'll take the question in 1 minute. But we say now, what does it mean? Pirush, what does this mean? These two names that the first 5 chapters of Tanya were explaining, this first 5 chapters here were explaining that there's something called Havaye, and there's something called Elokim, and one's a power of creation and chesed, and one's a power of concealment and gvura, etc. You should know it's all one. It's all one. You should know that power of concealment. It's not just that they're both serving the same point. The reason I'm giving you less water from the fire hose is in order to give you a receivable amount. But really, it's something called Tzimtzum, something called chesed. No, there really is no difference. Chesed and gevurah are the same thing. All the things we told you, really, there is no difference. Why? Mishum Shemi, that we explained in Pasach Al Yom, Mishum Shemi Deisav Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, B'Siach Deis Imay B'Yichud Gomer. Hashem and His Middos are one. And since Hu Shmai Echad, we said Hashem and His name are one. At that time, we'll see the truth. There's no God and His name. There's no God and say, okay, there's God, and then His kindness. God and His strictness. It's all one thing. It's all God. We know His Middos are His names. And now you'll know automatically there's nothing else. There is no Elokim and no Havaye. It's all just God's essence. And all these names of Elokim and Havaye are just appearances to us to make us understand it. And also, let me see if I didn't jump too far. Yeah, okay. Let me take a step back first. Before I go further, let me explain one more thing. What's bothering the Alter Rebbe here now, is as follows. When we explain the verse means, like we used to think it means, that you should know nothing else exists besides God. So it made sense to say, Ein Oid, there's no one else around, at the end of the pasuk. But now we're saying the pasuk doesn't mean that there's only one God. We're telling you that you should know that the Elokim and Havaye are really one. So what's the second half of the pasuk saying? The Ein Oid, because the pasuk finishes off. Nothing else. Why are we adding on ein oid? If we were saying that the whole pasuk is telling us no one else exists, no other God, it makes sense to say there's nothing else. But why are we saying now ein oid if the whole point is that not that there's no other God, but there's the Havaye and Elokim are all really one? It seems to be two unrelated points in a pasuk, and that's what I wanted to say first. Now we can go back and say this. V'im kain, going back just a few lines. V'im kain, third to last word on the line. Memela teda. And now, because we're going to explain that Havaye and Elokim are really one, now you'll come to understand what it means ein oid in a whole new light also. Just like we explained the first half of the verse in a new light. It doesn't mean there's no other God. It means there's no such a thing as Elokim and Havaye separate, it's all one. Now let's understand what it means ein oid. Because Havaye and Elokim are all one, then there can't exist before God the world. The earth, the world doesn't exist as a separate entity. We see it. Before God, there is no separate entity of the world. That's the oid. Pirish, Shagam, Sheba Shemai, Pirish. Shagam, Ha'oretz HaChumriyis, Sheniris, Yesh Gomer Ein Koil, that even this earth, the planets that we're on now, which clearly are seen to us as actually existence, that's how we see it. But before Hashem, compared in Hashem's presence, in Hashem's perspective, nothing else exists. How is there exist a world? Because of Shem Elokim, right? How does a world exist? Because Shem Elokim conceals godliness, and therefore the world can exist. But if really there is no Shem Elokim as far as God's concerned, it's only as far as we're concerned, that means as far as God's concerned, there's no world. Because the world can't exist without Elokim. That means the whole, so back to the metaphor we said before, that the whole metaphor only exists from our perspective. From God's perspective, because Elokim is not a reality separate from Havaye, that means there is no existence of a world. So once we know that Elokim and Havaye are really one, automatically, by Hashem's perspective, automatically we know ein oid, there doesn't exist anything outside of God. So from God's ultimate perspective, the altruistic way that God sees the world, there is nothing else besides Him, nothing else exists. What you see here as a cup is really just godliness. We see it as a cup because we're in a physical world. God sees it as just godliness. It's here, but to Him it's godliness, us it's a cup. Go argue about it. Now that we know that in truth the whole Elokim and Havaye, two separate levels, two separate truths. One is a giving, one is a reconciling. One is a chesed, one's a gvura, is only as far as we're concerned. And as far as Hashem's concerned, there is no separation of two separate powers. That means as far as Hashem is concerned, there is no world. Therefore, once you know by Hashem that Havaye and Elokim are one, automatically come to the realization, ein oid, nothing else can exist. Because the only way to say something else exists is if you have Elokim. If Elokim is a real concealment, if there really is a concealment and God does not have His full presence everywhere else, then you could say there are other things besides God. There's God, and there's other things in the world too. But once we know there's no separation between Havaye and Elokim, automatically we come to the conclusion, ein oid, everything else that exists only exists in our realm, in our perspective. In our perspective, it's real. Don't worry, it's really here. But from God's perspective, it doesn't exist. Not doesn't exist in front of God, because God, which is Havaye, and His name Elokim, which is concealment, and therefore, in God's perspective, the earth and all that is within the earth, which is all the living creatures, they're not and non-existence before God. You can't even call it oid. Now the Alter Rebbe is going to explain the word oid in itself. What does the word oid mean? We have a word in Hebrew called oid. Ein oid levad, nothing else. So we're going to explain, and we're going to get to a very beautiful metaphor now of the body and the soul. The body is going to be called myself. Sorry, the soul is going to be myself, and the body is going to be called oid, the other thing or the extra, the add-on. And we're going to see a very interesting difference in how the soul and the body operate different than how the soul, than God and the world operate. There are two things that seem to be similar: a body and a soul, and God and the world. Both seem the body is existence physically, and the soul gives it life and power, etc. And you have a world that exists, a universe, and God giving it life. God is like the soul of the universe. But we're going to see a very major difference in the two, and we'll get to the end of this discussion. We'll try and do some more today. All right. What does the word oid mean? We can't even call earth and its existence before God even the name Oid. What is the word Oid? The word Oid means something which is secondary, something which is almost not as important. There's a very interesting discussion in the Talmud in Gemara Kedushin. And the Gemara Kedushin discusses what words have to be said to a woman by a man to become engaged. And it has to be said, the official words are, Harei at mikudeshes li. You are betrothed to me. And the word mikudeshes means really like Kiddush separated. You are now separated to me. You can't have a relation with anybody else, only with me. Until a minute ago, you could marry almost anyone in the world. That was a fit shidduch. But now you can only marry me and no one else. You cut off from everybody else as far as relationships, as long as we're married. So the word mikudeshes means you are now separate from the rest of the world. The Gemara then discusses, what's if I say other words? You are, and it gives all different interesting cases of what the person would say. I think one of the words are, if he says, you're my charufa. You're like my, I'm not even sure what charufa means, but it's like my belonging.
Something that cut from me.
Cut from me, pardon me. So the Gemara says an interesting answer. You know what? In the pasuk we have that charufa should be good, because we find in the Torah, etc., etc. And also we find in the area of Yehuda. You know, in Israel you have various neighborhoods. You have we have a famous area called Aza. Then you have something called Yehuda, Shomron, Aza. Yehuda is the Judah, Samaria, and Gaza are the three areas. There's an area called Judah. In the area of Judah, they used to use also this expression. So the Gemara says, one second, you're quoting a pasuk, and you're adding on as an also the city. That's disrespectful. Imagine I say, I asked the king, and you have permission to do this and this, and I also give you permission. Who the heck are you to be also? You know, it says in the code of Jewish law that this is the right thing to do, and I agree. Who is the I agree? You know, it says in the pasuk this word, and also people call it the same thing. So the words v'oid it uses Yehuda, v'oid l'kra, you bring Yehuda as an also, as an extra to the pasuk. It's disrespectful. It's one thing if you say that I think such a thing, and by the way, I might be right, because we find a similar thing in the Torah. But once you give the source that's unreproachable to add on someone else, it's like, the governor said you could do it, and I also get permission. It's like, who are you to be at? So that's the style in the Gemara. So there we see the word oid means something extra added on. So even something extra added on doesn't exist before God. You can't even say the world is here. Okay, it's not the same as God, not the same existence, but it's something. Before God, it's absolutely ayin v'efes. It's not even an oid. That's why I say mitachas la'aretz. That even an oid, even just an extra, an add-on, it's not even that much. And then he gives another metaphor. I'm actually going to stop here because this metaphor is quite lengthy and very beautiful. The body and the soul. We'll do it next week. But just to conclude, what we want to say from here is something phenomenal, which only Chassidus tells us this teaching. This is a very advanced understanding of the pasuk, and this really is the crux of what I think these chapters are all about. It's not just the awareness that there's only one God, because really, even without Chassidus, you should believe that and know that. A person shouldn't have to learn Tanya for that. Here we're teaching you a very deep understanding of God, that within God, there's nothing else. In the world and essence and truth of God, all existence is not. But to get there, we explain one more thing first, that there isn't different parts of God. There isn't the God that's the kind person and the strict person, the giving and the restricting. There's God and his name. Hashem, Elokim, Hashem and his name is one. In other words, Havaye and Elokim are one. And this really is, if you want to be a little technical, what we're saying in Shema. What are we saying in the pasuk of Shema every time we say Shema? Shema Yisrael, Hear Israel, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Havaye and Elokim, Hashem Echad is all one. And that's a much deeper understanding. Usually we say what it means. A God is all one and nothing else exists. That's elementary. That's important. As a Tanya learning individual, you could say Shema Yisrael means listen. Shema means listen. It's not a simple thing. Listen. And Yisrael, talking to the Jew, the essence of the soul. Hashem Elokeinu, the world of Havaye and the world of Elokim, Hashem Echad is all one. There's not separate powers to God. There's not the right hand, left arm. And just understand, in Christianity, lahavdol, there is a belief that there's God and a force that fights against him. In other words, in God, and there's a devil. And God, so to speak, has to try and overcome the challenge of the devil. We're not going that direction. That's not even the discussion here to say that there's no other force against God. What we're saying is something much, much more profound. that within Hashem himself, there aren't different levels. In the truth, whenever we talk about Hashem as levels and parts and components, are already talking about a very low level of God, how it is relating to the world. In relation to the world, yes, I dress up as this, I dress up as that. It's like a mother, the love to a child, or the deep love that's found from that person to someone else. All the different behaviors are really just different behaviors. In my deepest essence, is just me, and I love you. All the other things that I express to you are momentary required expressions based on circumstances outside of myself. Right now, I'm giving you candy. Right now, I'm holding you back. I'm giving you a walk. I'm protecting you. I'm watching over you. But that's all not really me. That's all things I do because I'm me. Because I'm me and because I love you, sometimes I'm kind. Sometimes I say no. Sometimes I say yes. Sometimes I say 5 more minutes. Sometimes I'll behave in certain ways. All those things are not really me. They're just me. Because of me, I do these things. By Hashem, all those behaviors don't exist outside of himself at all. So even the Elokim doesn't really exist. Whereas by a human being, I have a moment where I'm being kind. And that's kindness, which is really, by Hashem, there is no separate kindness. That kindness doesn't really exist as a separate existence. It only appears that way to us, like the student who hears the mashal. We hear the metaphor, so we say, oh, there's a metaphor. To the teacher, there never was a metaphor, there never was the fruit, never spilled. It just tried to get a point across, and therefore use that vehicle. And this is something which she says, V'hashavesa, you have to work on this. You got to think about it. And it can take years and years to come to this sort of understanding, because it's a very deep, very almost abstract way to see Hashem. So you have to think about it, understand it in a wholesome way, in a healthy way, to understand, how do I relate to this idea? At the end of the day, one thing that comes from it is understanding that our knowledge of God is limited to the way we perceive him, and we project ourselves, and that's not the true way to serve God. The way to serve God is not from our projection, how it makes sense to us, but how is God really? And that's what the Tanya is telling us. God really doesn't have separate parts, doesn't have separate elements. It's all one. And somewhere in the middle, we try and relate to that, which is what Chassidus tries to work with us.